Oh, perfect. Welcome to the special meeting of council, December the 17th, 2019. One notice to the public. These reports will be available tomorrow. Approval of the agenda.
It's moved by Councillor Dennis Perrier, seconded by Councillor Rick Owen, that council approves the agenda for its special meeting of council held December 17th, 2019, as presented.
All in favor? Passed. Any declaration of pecuniary interest? None declared. Reports of municipal officers and communications. Yves LaBelle, Interim Chief CAO.
Yes, I'd like to introduce everyone, the team from Strategy Corp. We have Tony, John, and the Celios. We'll make a presentation tonight on the organizational and the strategic review for the municipality. After many months of preparing for this and interviewing staff and councillors, and the floor is all yours, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Just get this straight. Is that coming through okay? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be back in Kirkland Lake. This has been a fascinating project, and you know, it's run its course over about, I guess, a little bit more than 5 months of intensive activity. We started off with our first full day sessions back in June, and as you recall, we had very productive meetings with you all in council back in August, visited again in early October, and we've been preparing the report since. Just by way of introduction, there will ultimately be 3 documents before you. There's the one Word document that's about a little more than 100 pages long, and we're not going to be speaking so much to that one directly tonight. That's the detailed findings of the organizational review. There's a lot of kind of detailed recipe book kind of stuff in there about ways to improve the organization, and we really have to thank you know, both council for helping guide us as to where to look, but also really staff for helping us dig into a lot of these matters. A lot of what you see in that report is frankly the results of staff and staff's hard work with us. The second document you'll have is the one that's labeled Corporate Strategic Review, and it has 2 sections in it. It's got the first one that outlines the draft strategic plan, and council, that's very much your work. But we saw it as a very, like frankly, we were quite delighted with the results of the strategic planning process. I've got to tell you, I've done, I think, 16 strategic plans for councils in the last 6 months, or 12 months now. And it struck me as one that really kind of nails, in a very fair way, both the legitimate challenges that Kirkland Lake faces, but puts a very positive approach on trying to address them. The third section is the organizational review, and between the summaries of that we'll mostly be working with now, there's about 130 pages or so of PowerPoint slides that we'll be covering. So the combined report runs about 240 pages long. I'm sure that it will fuel your Christmas holiday vacation reading, and there'll be lots to talk about. But what you'll see, I think, when you put it all together, is a fairly optimistic plan. You know, certainly when we began the project, we were first retained back in May. There was a lot of concern, there was a lot of negativity, and we've been, you know, it may have been that over the period of time that since we've been studying, the freeze has set into Kirkland Lake, but I don't think that's true of the corporation, where we've actually seen a considerable thawing and improvement and just general fresh approach from both council and from staff. So we're actually really pleased to be here to be able to report on the contents of this. Just by way of reminder, and my colleague Vasilios will help make sure that I keep advancing the slides properly. There were a number of project tasks defined by the RFP. Obviously it was to confirm the corporation's key businesses and establish an organizational structure that'll provide efficient and effective service, determine the appropriate staffing levels and professional development strategies to meet the current and future levels of service demand, and to determine how operational functions and workflow processes can be made more efficient. And through the course of the strategic plan, the organizational review, and the operations review, we address all three of these things. The aspiration of this was really to help refocus the capacity on the strategic resources as set by council. And of course, we didn't complain, but to do all three simultaneously is a bit like trying to redesign an aircraft while it's in flight. And so it was actually a great challenge that you set for us, trying to do these three projects simultaneously. Because, like, in a way, you can't know how to refocus the organizational capacity and resources on the strategic priorities set by council until you have a fresh set of the strategic priorities set by council. And of course, what you have before you tonight is only a draft from us reflecting your work. So, you may find that things have evolved since you considered it last, or you may find that there's things that you want to further tweak or improve. Those are always living documents. So the interrelationship there is clear. It was also clear that you wanted there to be a focus on customer service in what you were doing, so the focus was on that, but also on accountability and operational improvements as it relates to accountability and effectiveness in operations and that. And we made a lot of findings in regard to this. And then ultimately having the organizational capacity to embrace and effectively manage change. And, this organization needs no lessons in change. If anything, I think a lot of the biggest challenges that you've experienced has been because of both enormous, tectonic changes that you had to address in your economy that spanned decades, sudden improvements, which you want to be able to, take advantage of, like a sudden oncoming tide. And then other changes, more they're more micro in nature, certainly compared to the price of gold, but they certainly had a really serious impact on the effectiveness of the organization. And when we were started off, we were told, the biggest single problem is the organizational structure. And honestly, again, by way of introductory comments, I'm not sure that we can agree that your biggest problem was organizational structure. But we can sure agree that gaps in your organizational team was something that was causing stress across the board. And the accumulation of, rapid changes and departures and, folks that, came in who didn't necessarily have effective transition because their previous person had sort of walked out, and there had been big gaps, and the degree to which gaps in the org structure had perpetuated over a period of time. That's clearly one of the biggest drivers of difficulty that had its impacts across the organization in terms of its effectiveness. And I think one of the reasons why we can be optimistic without being in any way naive is because of the remarkable progress that you're making in terms of filling a lot of these gaps right now. Because if the problems were caused by the gaps and you're filling the gaps, there's good reason to believe that you're making good progress. So that's, I think, pretty much it by way of introductory comments. So perhaps we'll get into some of the meat of the strategic plan. I'm going to propose to probably discuss this the least of the three sections because it's the one that you're the most intimately aware of because of the work that you've already done in it. You'll recall, but for the benefit of those who didn't go through the process, that each member of council participated in one-on-one interviews with us. Those interviews were confidential. All the content was anonymized, but the purpose of it was for each of you to address the main issues facing Kirkland Lake, having regard to each of the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. And we also took this information from senior management team as well. And through that process, we put together the SWOT pages that are summarized in your package at pages 9 to 14. And those SWOT pages were designed to be a general kind of, in what in the good old days of municipal resolutions would have been your whereas clauses. Whereas this is going well, and whereas this isn't going quite so well, and whereas this is a great opportunity, and whereas we'd jolly well better get on top of this, therefore these are the sorts of things that we'd like to see in our strategic plan. And that was made available to you to help kind of jumpstart the strategic planning session that we had on October the 3rd. And there were really two key decisions that council made at that time. One was about the horizon of the plan, which was that we were to be talking for a term of give or take 5 to 10 years. In other words, not only things that we could achieve within the term of this council, but that we were setting our sights to problems that might take longer to fix than that, but that were appropriately part of the strategic plan. The other thing was scope. And this is really important because there's plenty of municipalities these days that are doing community-based plans. And by community-based plans, what they typically mean is a plan that's a plan for the whole community. And you may want to do those at some point, but council's decision was to focus more on a plan for the operations of the Corporation of Kirkland Lake. And that's just a really important thing because you know, a lot of times strategic plans are being done these days which will have a very deliberate kind of outreach to you know, hospitals or healthcare or other elements of civil society or that sort of thing, to make sure that you're thinking about that in an integrated fashion, and that's something that's worth doing. But this was meant to be more focused on a plan for the actual operations of the Corporation of Kirkland Lake. And so that's what you'll see contained in the document. So 5 to 10 year horizon, and with a focus on the government, not the whole place. The second big activity that we did was we validated the draft SWOT analysis and went through it, and you know, added a few things, and the additions are captured here, and then went through a process of discussing the shared priorities. I don't propose to go through the SWOT analysis. And so we'll power through some of those slides, but they are here as a record for you. Some of the conversations that you had are in effect captured then in the slides that occur between 19 and 23. And I think I'm going to dispense with those two in the interest of time. What they did was, the best thing about a SWOT analysis, it says, well, you know, we got this strength, but we got these weaknesses, and so how are we going to use this strength to overcome these weaknesses and address either the goal that we're trying to achieve or mitigate the risks that we face that lead us to an opportunity. And each of the opportunities that you identified through your conversations, you ultimately wound up capturing in the draft plan. And so if you go to 24, you'll see the beginnings of the blocks of a plan for Kirkland Lake. Now, the structure that I've used is not uncommon to most strategic plan structures. On the top, you've got a vision and mission, which are always the hardest things to write because you're trying to capture the entire organization in just the very briefest of phrases. The vision as to where you want to be, and the mission as to what your day-to-day activities are. And if that's like the roof, the foundation is the values. And so there's values that are described in it. And then there's a series of goals, and you identified 5. And in each case, there's this kind of a short title, and then a longer version that explains the goal in a full sentence. And then there's a series of priority actions. And so if you look at slide 26, this is a summary of the short titles of each of the key goals and then the longer descriptions of them. I'll get to the mission and values and that sort of thing in due course. And there's a page that elaborates on each one of these. The 5 key goals that you identified were achieving financial stability, and more fully expressed as achieving financial stability for the corporation while maintaining competitive and affordable tax rates. So a real focus there on the bottom line and making sure that it's affordable to people. But then that was juxtaposed against 2, which was achieving sustainable operational excellence with a focus on appropriately high levels of customer service. So once you get into those 2 balanced together, then you're really starting to speak about value for money. It's not just that we're going to make it as cheap as possible. It's that we're going to strike the right balance between having it be affordable and competitive, but also of sufficient quality that people would expect, having regard to the expectations of Kirkland Lake. Now, if you're going to do those things, you have to have a team to do it. And so 3 is building the Kirkland Lake team. And the further elaboration there was building and maintaining an adequate team known for its culture of professionalism and excellence. So the idea there is to make sure that we've got a kind of go team, go environment within which people can be achieving this financial sustainability and operational excellence. Now 4 was where we really captured the observation that the economy in Kirkland Lake these days is booming, and we have to do what we can to make sure that we're a great partner in that. But also there was a real focus that you had on diversifying the local economy, you know, recognizing that ultimately mining is not a renewable resource. So the idea was to ensure that you were taking advantage of the current prosperity, but making and building stuff that was sustainable. And then 5 was about improving our capacity to communicate and enhancing the reputation and of the Corporation of Kirkland Lake through our communications. And as you'll see, that's each in the sense of internal communications and external communications, and communications with your government partners, the federal and provincial governments notably. So what follows is a slide on each, and I'm not sure that you would want me to actually read these at you in their entirety, but as you can see on the financial sustainability one, the priority actions then get built out. And so you identified ensuring that you've got appropriate reserves and appropriate asset management plans to ensure, so if you, that's the 1-2 punch of we've got a long-term plan for paying and maintaining for things, and a long-term plan for making for sure that we have the money to do so. There was a proper review of the competitiveness of Kirkland Lake taxes and rates and fees in order to ensure that you're getting what you should, where you should be getting it, but also making sure that you're competitive. Evaluating opportunities for newer enhanced revenue, such as the accommodation tax, and also reviewing the affordability of legacy assets. And we've advanced the conversation through our reports on pretty much each of these subjects, actually, but these were the things that you'd identified as being your priorities under this. Your priorities under achieving sustainable operational excellence. These are really important because updating the departmental operating plans, one of the things that we observed and that you had observed was that most of the departments were operating with out-of-date operating plans. And so the idea was update the operating plans, improve the opportunities for performance measurement, and once you can do that, you can embrace continuous improvement because you're measuring, and so you can continuously improve against something that you're measuring on. And then you can evaluate your service levels to make sure that they're at a level that's adequate but not inappropriately high. Second broad heading, a little bit more micro, because that updating the departmental operating plans, that was pretty much across the board. Second thing was to make sure that we improve the procurement process from a point of view of delivering better service to the internal customers of that process, but also to make sure that we have adequate internal controls and that we're achieving the best in cost efficiencies. And that's certainly a trend you see across government right now. One of the major initiatives the Government of Ontario is undertaking in its own name is much more of a focus on improved procurement processes. So this is very much on trend. Third thing that you identified was improving the fire services. So this is like a specific dive into a departmental operating plan, and this was following on from the fire master plan that you had done, making sure that you had addressed the deficiencies there, but also evaluating opportunities for increased efficiency in operations. And then there was a real focus on bylaw enforcement, which seemed to have some interesting crossover opportunities with respect to addressing derelict buildings and potentially increasing opportunities for infill within the town. Under building the Kirkland Lake team, you identified, the goal is to have a proper HR and succession plan and training plan, so to make Kirkland Lake an employer of choice and creating a culture of health and safety and compliance, and committing to a culture of professional staff-council relations, and addressing organizational structure and workload issues. And when we first arrived, I think that was probably the issue that was most on people's minds, discontinuities in the workload burdens that were really stressing a lot of people out and really contributing to some of the morale issues. So that was very much an urgent matter. And I think we've addressed that actually through we've made a contribution to addressing that through the report. The fourth was promoting growth and economic development, so that becomes further or updated as be a great partner to the mining industry. So basically, do whatever you can to help them do as well as they can to get as much as you can for Kirkland Lake. But seeking to convert new mining jobs into permanent residents, that came up again and again and again, that the idea isn't to just have folks that are, sojourning here as they're working, but then going back home to some other place, but getting a whole new team of folks who are coming in here to call Kirkland Lake home, with all the benefits that that'll bring to the local economy. And of course, helping to diversify the local economy. And then there was talk of ensuring that the official plan adequately supports current economic opportunities, and there was discussion of evaluating opportunities to recruit investors in residential development, and certain amount of concern that the costs around that development was a deterrent to people settling here and making a home here. And another piece of this was evaluating the supply of serviced lands and evaluating the overall business case for bringing more serviced lands on stream. So, this in each one of these cases, this was all sort of should be read with the asterisk of, as doable through business case and all that kind of thing. And then finally, improving our capacity to communicate. The idea was to create a culture of transparency through proactive communication, improve our capacity for intergovernmental relations, improving both our internal and external communications, and there was a strong theme here that came through that we captured. This is not meant to tell a story. This is meant to communicate genuine progress in this plan and create a culture of confidence through transparency about what's really going on. I think it's always important to capture the sincerity when communication is meant to be, we want to do a good job, and then we want to make sure we're seen to be doing a good job, not we just want to put a better spin on what's going on. That was very much the tone of your deliberations. So the page the next, which is 32, I guess, just kind of summarizes it all on one page and demonstrates that I can make boxes of odd sizes which fit on one page that capture your strategic plan without going cross-eyed. But it's kind of handy to have it all at a glance. The vision, mission, and values was an interesting conversation. What I captured, and look, you may want to take some more look at this, or you may think you nailed it kind of on a fairly hole-in-one basis. You'll recall we didn't have a really long conversation about it, and the unedited comments from that council session are captured in the box that you see on the left. But deriving from that came a couple of different vision and mission statements. Mindful that we're focusing here on the municipal corporation, there was one vision that was captured as Kirkland Lake will be a model of public service done right, or another vision was people have confidence in what we do and in the value they get for their taxes. And this is recognizing that a vision is a statement of what we want to be. So underlying all of this was a sort of a recognition that we may not be there yet, but that's what everything we would want to do would be leading towards. The mission that came through was we operate, maintain, and grow Kirkland Lake, its services and assets as it should be done, with a focus on sustainability, affordability, and customer service. So really capturing in one sentence through the mission this sort of balance between we want to be sustainable and competitive on a fiscal side, but we want to have an appropriate level of services, and this has regard to both our assets and the way in which we do things, all with a view on sustainability and affordability. So I began my opening comments by saying this struck me as a very reasonable strategic plan. When I listen to a council talking about those sorts of values, that's kind of way I say it's a very, very reasonable plan. There's, one goes to places where people get a bit pie in the sky sometimes. There is no pie in the sky here. It is utterly reasonable to want to achieve the attributes that you're describing here. And given your mindset at the time you were writing it, or thinking about it, it felt like a very authentic way of capturing what was on your mind. The three value pillars, these boxes are actually really handy, and I'll tell you why. It's because they're the things that underpin everything that you want to do. And if you have them in the values boxes, then you don't have to repeat yourself a million times in all of your individual commitment statements. And so if you're committed in everything you do to being focused on prosperity and quality of life and being connected and inclusive and diverse and caring, and one of the more lyrical moments that you shared was a community where I may be by myself, but I'm never alone, was this notion of a culture of a place that was more than just a businessy place, if you will, something more humane or human than that. But then within your strict organizational culture, team-oriented, focus on integrity, trustworthiness, safety, innovation, and professionalism. And then in regard to the public service side, again, these values of fiscally responsible, environmentally sustainable, customer service, accountability, transparency, continuous improvement. So again, a very appropriate suite of attributes. And so if you look at a kind of a shrunken down version of it that takes out all the detailed points, on 36, you got a vision where you're a model of public service done right. People have confidence in what we do and the value they get. You got a mission of we operate, maintain, and grow its services as they should be done with a focus on sustainability, affordability, and customer service. You got your 5 goals as previously described in your 3 pillars. So I thought you did a pretty darn good day's work on that, honestly. Obviously it's for you to decide whether it captures in the right way what you want. But here's a notion of some next steps. You'll recall that we talked about SMART goals. And SMART goals are goals which are specific, achievable, measurable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, by defining those things as being your priorities, you have made the judgment that they are relevant, and that is your judgment to make. It is actually, in my opinion, and I think the regular thinking in the municipal sector, it is not council's job to come up with stuff that's specific, achievable, measurable, and time-bound. That's staff's job. Your job is to say, these are our broad strategic goals, bring us back a report on how something that's more specific, right? That's where you pass the baton to them. And so if you see the 4 blue boxes that I have here, your next steps would be either approve this draft or make such tweaks to it as may be required, but approve this draft language, and then you pass it to staff to develop and approve the implementation plans. Now, some of them might say, you know what, we can come back to you in 2 or 3 weeks with a plan on this one. Others, frankly, they might need to not come back to you for, like, it might take them 6 months of work, and you got a lot of strategic work to do at Kirkland Lake. I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic because I think this is a place that's going to be pretty good at rolling up its sleeves over the next couple of years. So it's not like there isn't a lot of work to do. It's just that there's all manageable work to do. Big difference. It's not done yet. But developing and improving the implementation plans to come back with goals that are SMART goals is going to be really important, because you don't want to be sitting here in 3 years and say, well, we had this great strategic plan. It's got lots of boxes, but we didn't actually make any progress on it because we didn't come up with anything that's measurable. So what you want is stuff that's measurable, but it's not on council to come up with those details. So the next step would be for staff to come back with various implementation plans, which you would then approve and say, yeah, you know what, that was kind of what we had in mind, and we can afford to do that, whether it's over 1 year or 3 years or 5 years, being mindful that you had this as being up to a 10-year plan. Like, for example, you're not going to be able to fully fix your problem of your underfunded asset management plan and underfunded reserves in 1 year. Like, that's not going to happen. But you can create a plan in a year and fix it over a decade. And so there's going to be a need to be able to keep score as you're making progress. Because, if goal number 5 is communicate progress, well, you can't communicate progress if you don't have a plan to tick off progress against, right? So you'd be linking the approved plans to implementation plans and work plans and build that into departmental annual budgets. And then you just track progress over time and report back on it periodically. So don't let anybody tell you, oh, well, those 5 boxes that you identified or 5 goals that you set out, they're all too vague. Because they're not. It's just step 1 of a strategic plan. And an operating plan and cumulative annual budgets, that's where you turn it into SMART goals. but you've dealt with the R of SMART by deciding that these things are relevant. So that gets you pretty much to the end of the first section, which is the draft strategic plan. And it's probably very appropriate to take some questions on that now before we move on. But I hope you like it, because honestly, it came more from you than it did from us. But we actually think it's quite good.
I think some of the points were brought up in that work session that we all did together. There was a lot of common concerns, and since that time, it's 5 months ago, and we've actually, I feel we've made some headway on some of the smaller items. They may not be dramatic, but I think it sunk in pretty well. It worked. It was a great session, and we've started to make some of these changes that are suggested here. So I think we got a good kickstart. We got to put a full-fledged plan in place, an action plan as to how we're going to do some of these things. But I do think we have a good start. I don't think anybody would disagree with the priorities. That was pretty evident in that work group session. Any comments from other councillors? Councillor Arvinoff?
Yeah, actually, I was expecting more. I was expecting something more specific. You know, the solutions, you know, to some of the issues in Kirkland Lake. I was hoping that we would have some answers to some of the issues that they're dealt with. I know there's a lot of goals here, but I was hoping that we would have goals and some of the solutions at the same time.
So if I can just respond.
Yeah.
That's not this document.
No.
This document is your strategic plan. That's the answer that you give to the question, may I take your order, please? And it's a snapshot of what you did back in October. So it's just 2 months ago, actually. So the rest of the document, in many cases, we actually do answer these things. But we wouldn't have put that into your mouth. Our answers are our answers, and they're in our report. This is our capturing of your strategic plan. But I do want to emphasize what I just said, you know, perhaps on page 37. Council does not have accountability to come up with a detailed 27-point work plan about how to implement any one of these things. But frankly, neither do we. Like, that is an operational plan matter to be developed by your operating departments on those things. So a strategic plan process we would view as being the smallest of the elements of the task that we were assigned to do. And this reflects a fairly typical strategic plan. What you need now are the staff operating plans that are going to give meaningful effect to this, having regard to your specific resources.
Is it fair to say that these 98 pages cover off probably a lot of what Eugene's concerns are? At least some of them are in there, more identifiable than the overall overview.
Yeah, I think so.
Any other comments? There's a lot to digest.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more. We're only on page 36.
Yeah, I got you.
So look, you may want to think through whether there's anything that's missing from there or whatever. But I think that's a pretty good Polaroid snapshot of where your heads were around the strategic plan. And what it does is it gives a pretty clear indication to staff as to what the strategic goals of this council are. And you really don't want to underestimate the importance of having a clear statement of what council's goals are that's reducible to one page. Because there's a lot of different interpretations that staff can have as to what their mission is. And I think you've provided a very clear set of balanced goals here as to what you're trying to achieve for Kirkland Lake. So that's a very significant contribution to fixing your governance issues by having a clear set of goals.
I think too what, this is what when we first got elected, we said, let's put our goals together, what we want to achieve. And to be quite honest with you, 6 new councillors, a new mayor, everybody's learning their position. There's a big learning curve. There were so many issues to deal with that I think it's not that we avoided them, but we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants for a while. The last 3 or 4 months, I think it's starting to come together and working on some of these key issues that we were concerned about, and more setting goals, maybe not as specific as this, but I think it gives us a clearer view of where we were and where we should be going. So I think that's what happened at the beginning. Hey, we're only 1 year in office, so in term, so this gives us a clearer direction where we should be going. That's how I feel anyway.
And you know, the vision and mission are clear. I'm not sure that they're the stuff of battle cries or anthems, but they are clear. And so, you know, like one could wordsmith that, and you might well be able to improve it. But I'm not sure, given the focus of Kirkland Lake right now, I'm not sure that, like, unless you feel it's a clear miss as to what you're trying to achieve, I'm not sure that that's the best use of your time. But I mean, I think when we got together to talk about it last time, spent about an hour on it, it was an authentic representation of what you were coming together with. But the various pieces and how they fit into the 5 pillars, I think that's a pretty good snapshot.
See, just to go back to what I was saying when we first were elected, and I asked each councillor to give their priorities on different things that they felt we should do. And to be honest with you, we were all over the map. And it made it difficult there was a lot of issues to deal with, more than what we thought. And as I said, I think this now kind of pins it down, what the main focus, what we have to do. And we didn't have that direction, so I think that's a good start. We have started, but and made some headway, I would agree. But this is going to give us clearer direction.
And certainly that's of importance with the high number of new staff you have coming in, to have a clear statement of what your overall direction is in general attitude and approach. It will fall to them, you know, with some of the content in this report to achieve some specifics as to what to do to have yourself full SMART goals, but this helps give them general marching orders, and that's a big part of what was missing, I think, in from the governance of Kirkland Lake previously. So there's 2 other sections to the report. I would probably normally move to the organizational review next, but out of consideration for the folks that are guests, I believe that would appropriately be done in camera as a matter related to HR, and so we can do the operational review portion now to make it more convenient for the folks that are visiting, if that's acceptable to council.
Don't want to make you wait outside.
The operational review, so just for those who aren't familiar, a strategic plan is a council strategic plan is literally just that. It's council saying these are the things we want to tackle. It's usually a short list. It doesn't usually have a lot of detail. An operational review goes basically as appropriately far down into the weeds as the organization can manage at the time the operational review is done. And so what we find is they're often done in 2 phases. They're often done first as a kind of a general exploration, and then a deeper referral into deeper detail. Other times you go to a place that's say, better positioned to get down deep into detail, and so you're able to kind of start there. And it's not uncommon for there to be two phases to this sort of thing. So what we found when we arrived was that it was appropriate to do kind of the first high-level operations review. A decent analogy is it's like the difference between going to your GP, having a general physical, and then your GP might say, well, you know, your blood pressure is a little high, I'm going to send you to a specialist on that, or something else is wrong, I'm going to send you to a specialist on that. So what we're presenting here is kind of a general higher level operational review, and it was designed to address many of the specific questions that council asked us through the interview process that were very much on your minds when we were talking to you. The approach that we took, we began by reviewing your key corporate documents and policies and previous reviews and budgets and that sort of thing, just kind of get the baseline. And then the second thing we did was we took a look and did our own kind of financial analysis of Kirkland Lake's 2019 data, and then the financial information returns data from 2013 to 2018. So that when I talk about the FIRs, that's what that is, and those are the required postings that go up to Ontario. And as you'll hear, there's always some issues with the FIRs. We then did interviews and workshops with council, as you know, but also with staff. We had a significant number of either one-on-ones or telephone calls or meetings, and then interdepartmental workshops, and then a cross-functional workshop. So we did a considerable amount of work to try and get a feel of the place, not just at the senior management level, but also at the level of people who are mid-level managers and frontline operating folks. And then we did some financial and operational benchmarking, because there's always two ways to compare. Compare against yourself and compare against everyone else. And the easiest way to think about that is, you know, I could tell you I lost 15 pounds, and my doctor could tell you that compared to other men who are 6'2", I'm still 15 pounds too heavy. So is it good that I lost 15 pounds? Yes. And is it bad that I'm still 15 pounds too heavy? Yes. And so it's always useful to have both the comparison to how you're doing compared to yourself, as well as how you're comparing to others, and to see whether how you're doing is good enough, if you will. And so through these steps, we were working to identify where you stand with respect to your peer groups, and where the opportunities are for major activities and programs with respect to cost savings, and where the opportunities are for continuous improvement. In presenting the major findings, there's really sort of four things that we're going to be talking about. Some gaps that we found, and then looking at your own performance, and then your performance with peers, and then understanding some options for change. And I think Councillor Ivanov, you'll be particularly interested in the options for change section, because we very much had that in mind. If we were in your shoes and we had the strategic plan that you had, how would you act on some of this? And so I think that may be where we get to answer some of the questions that that you see arising from the strategic plan. My colleagues are going to jump in a minute, but I'll just start off with the four significant gaps. And when we first arrived, we were told the biggest problem was the organizational structure, and as we'll tell you during the organizational structure section, we don't actually think your biggest problem is your organizational structure. There's improvements to make to your organizational structure, but to the degree Kirkland Lake had issues, it wasn't because your organizational structure was wrong. But there were sort of four things that we thought really contributed to making the lives of everyone more difficult. And these are very doable fixes. One is there is no comprehensive service inventory of what we do. And so you've got a budget which tells you what you spend, but you actually do not have comprehensive inventories of what you do. We also do not necessarily have a comprehensive suite of policies about the standard to which we do those things, that we do not know entirely what they are. And then the third thing is we had a big bunch of gaps in the job descriptions of who's supposed to do what. And a lot of that was because, person A moves on or retires or leaves for whatever circumstances. Person B comes in. Person C leaves adjacent to person B. Person B picks up a third of person C's job, a chunk of person A's job. There is no HR person. Nobody bothers updating the job description. 6 months later, nobody can quite remember who's doing what. This is a real problem, because if you can't measure, you can't manage. And if you neither know exactly what you do, or to what standard, or who's supposed to do it, then what happens is, and please, this isn't in any way intended to be disrespectful, because this happens all the time in organizations that go through drift when people leave rapidly. It's just what it takes is strong leadership in various positions to say, okay, so-and-so left, next person up. We're going to reshuffle these responsibilities in this fashion, and we're going to have a conversation about whether you have the right responsibilities, and we're going to document it, and we're going to see how we go, and we're going to decide whether we're burning you out or stressing you out, or we're going to see whether, like, that's all really important stuff. And what we found was people working with policies that were old and no one knew whether they were still approved or not, people working with policies that were draft but that had never been approved. And again, I think one of the strengths that you identified in the SWOT was an extraordinary commitment by the staff of Kirkland Lake to step up and fill gaps without necessarily the best in training or the best in hand-holding or the best in support of any kind. And so, like, the real story here is a lot of people making do in a difficult circumstance. So let no one quote Strategy Corp as saying, we think that there's all kinds of people who don't know what they're doing or who are doing a crappy job or something like that. That's not it at all. I'm just going to say that again. That's not it at all. And if somebody quotes us that way, you will know that I said the opposite twice, just for emphasis. What you do have here is a breakdown in management that comes about when no one knows necessarily exactly what they are supposed to be doing, but they know that they're doing what they were told and they're doing it to the best job they can. But what it doesn't do is when council says, are we doing this as efficiently as possible? How can you get an answer? And you see, we had meetings where we said, please, as preparation to this, come in and tell us what you do. And we found huge resistance from the people who were coming to our meetings to fill in that chart about what they did, because they didn't know if they would give us the right answer or not. And we actually felt quite sympathetic for them. We actually didn't make a big deal out of it. We didn't press them on it. What they were doing was they were filling gaps. They were taking measures as they could. But please also don't think that we think that there's all kinds of people sitting around doing nothing. That's not it at all. It's that there just hasn't been a really comprehensive look taken at optimizing the efficiency of either what gets done or the policy to which level it's getting done or all that kind of thing. And we think that if you were to spend 6 or 8 months rewriting your policies, making sure that the old ones that you have been updated so that they actually reflect an affirmative choice about what you want them to be, as opposed to what they were and what might have been applicable 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. And you know, there's a lot of ways in which policies can become outdated. You know, like a policy around road maintenance that was from 10 or 15 years ago isn't going to be relevant anymore because there's been so many new technologies. You know, like iPads that are that you use for taking a photograph of the pothole and triggering a ticket system and all this kind of thing. The way you would have done it 10 years ago is not the way you would do it now. And so there's just a lot of stuff that got through all the disruption of senior people leaving and all that kind of thing, a lot of stuff that got worn down and broken down. And so the root cause isn't the structure, it's the gaps in the structure and the too frequent changes in the bodies in the structure. And then the willingness of people to step up and fill the gap and do the best they can. You know, if some people had said, hey, you haven't really told me what to do, and banged the table a little bit better, they might have done you a favor. But I think in a lot of cases, they were just trying to help. And so filling these 4 gaps, and the last one is, knowledge and documentation management.
Just before you go to that one, if you really look at it, and maybe you're gonna come to this later, but there wasn't any succession planning and training people to move ahead and within the corporation. And that it's killing us.
It's even worse, because succession planning is what happens when you have, like, an orderly idea of who's gonna leave, assuming somebody stays to retirement. What you were having was a lot of rapid departures, so it was even worse. So, yes, you're absolutely right, Mr. Mayor, but I would argue it's even worse. And so what some of the recommendations that we have are, you know, in a couple of places at least, thinking about planning for some succession in key spots where there are gonna be serious difficulties recruiting if we don't. So anyway, this is just one page, but it's a really important page. Because the other thing is this, I talked about how we go in and we do a plan that's, we do work that's appropriate for the organization that we find, right? If we had found that everybody could say with certainty, here is my job description, here is my inventory of services, here is how it relates to the budget, then we could do work that started to get down to the actual efficiency of how it's all happening. But when you arrive and you say, I don't have a job description, I don't have a policy, then it's kind of like, oh, I can't help you in the same way that I could if you did. So it's not to say that we stopped our work there, it's just we worked in different ways to get around it in different ways. But I think that to the degree that council has felt frustration, if it ever has, and I know it has because you told me, when I ask a question, how's it going, and you don't get a straight answer, I think this is at the root of it. But it is not non-compliance. It's not people not wanting to do their work. Like what we found again and again and again, and like the evidence is here. It's not just me saying nice things. I mean, there's a lot of pages here of really great ideas about how to make things better that come from your staff as curated by us. So did anybody notice I just said something else nice about your staff? Like these reports are not indictments of your staff group. What they are is criticisms of the problems that arise when you have gaps in your management group that then cause staff to be put in a very difficult position. So that's a really important page. I think Tony and Vasilios are going to give you a break from me for a minute and talk about financial performance.
As John said earlier, the financial analysis is 3 steps. The first one is to compare Kirkland Lake to itself and its history. The second part is to compare Kirkland Lake to its peer group of municipalities. And the third one is to isolate and examine elements of your budget and what the strategic decision implications of those are. So for the first part of comparing Kirkland Lake to itself and its history, we followed the structure of 4 items. The first one is we looked at, well, how does Kirkland Lake generate revenues? It's through property tax, what the assessment mix is. Then how does Kirkland Lake spend it? It's through capital expenses and operating expenses. Then how does it prepare and protect its finances for the future? What is the state of Kirkland Lake's reserves? And then what is its debt? So, well, let's go through each of these one at a time. Not benchmark, but our frame of reference is, well, what was the inflation the previous 5 years? And it grew between 2013 and 2018, which is the years that we looked at this 5-year framework. Through the FIRs, the financial information return that every municipality submits to the province. The inflation rate was 9.5% over this 5-year period. And the property taxes during this 5-year period grew at 5% faster than inflation. And this is not necessarily surprising, as municipal costs are typically a different mix than the factors that go into the calculation of inflation. Then when we look at, what was the operating expenditures of the municipality, the trend actually shows an increase of 6%, but that is 3.5% less than how much inflation increased during the same period of time. And then when we look at capital expenses, well, it's increased 8-fold, particularly in the previous year, 2017-2018. When we look at reserves and how Kirkland Lake, prepares and will protect its finances for the future, Well, a best practice would, show a steady, gradual increase in reserves. Instead, over this 5-year period, reserves have decreased by 2% per capita. And as part of its long-term capital plan, Council should consider dedicated contributions to increase these reserves. Then we looked at debt, and over this period, debt per capita has increased by 140% between 2013 and 2018, which also is tied with the capital expenditures, which increased eightfold during the same period. And then, we also looked at the assessment mix. We noticed that during this period, the amount dependent on residential became more and more significant, and it went from 61% to 67%. And the total value of taxable assessment increased by 35% over this 5-year period. In the next slide, we just wanted to show the numbers, and we've highlighted where those increases and decreases were and what stood out. But then the second step was, as we said, to compare Kirkland Lake also to a peer group of other municipalities. We again looked at the same period of years, and with particular focus in 2018. And we selected the municipality of Cochrane, Fort Frances, Kapuskasing, Timiskaming Shores, and Hearst. The criteria that we used to select these 5 other municipalities in the peer group were population. We wanted municipalities in Ontario, in Northern Ontario, that have a close or similar size of population, the number of households, the land area, the density of population, the length of roads paved, winter controlled, and the length of roads maintained during the winter time, bridges and culverts, and what is the primary private sector economy driver. In the RFP back in March, one of the requirements were that it's very important for someone to understand, and when comparing our municipality to others where there is a key economic private sector driver, and we've noted what each of these is in each of the 5 municipalities that we compared Kirkland Lake to. Using the same framework of how does each of these municipalities in Kirkland Lake generate revenue, how does it spend it, how does it prepare for the future with reserves, and what is the debt? We use the same framework when we compared Kirkland Lake to these 5 other municipalities. Some things that stood out. Based on the key indicators, Kirkland Lake's relative financial position may be better than some people think. On most indicators, it appears that Kirkland Lake is in the middle of the pack relative to its peer group. And Kirkland Lake is behind its peer group in terms of capital expenses per capita and its municipal debt per capita. However, the costs associated with the construction of some expensive capital projects explain many of the results. Again, let's look at revenue. Property taxes are in fact lower than the peer group for both per capita and per household. Yes, Councillor.
When you talk about property tax, are you separating commercial from residential?
It is, in this specific number, it is combined.
It's combined. So, I mean, if they have a whole bunch of commercial down south, in Liskeard, for example, and when you're comparing taxes, you're not comparing apples with apples, right?
And that is the challenge of intermunicipal benchmarking, but in many of these cases, there is quite some convergence in the assessment mix, but we will actually look at it in one of the next slides.
The property tax factors that are looked at can be broken down into residential, commercial, industrial, but generally for comparative purposes, they are consolidated. But you're absolutely right, depending on the community and the mix of assessment within those communities, there will be an imbalance and a weighted discrepancy depending on how heavy an assessment base they may have in commercial or industrial. And in the example with Kirkland Lake, as Vasilius will get to momentarily, Kirkland Lake has about 2/3 of a mix of residential and commercial, with 1/3 industrial because of the nature of the mine being located here. Other municipalities may have similar anomalies where there's a pulp and paper mill or a major employer that comprises a significant percentage of the assessment base. So again, those factors have to be looked at on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, no, I see that, but I mean, I'm looking at a tax rate of, in the tri-towns, for example, of 1.3, 1.4%, Kirkland Lake at almost a 3% residential tax rate, tax rate, double that for industrial or commercial. So, I mean, this, you know, the numbers here seem to me they're kind of skewed.
It is a very reasonable question, but in this particular case and the way that we selected the peer group, the variability of the mix, so the lowest, the average assessment mix was 68 or 69% residential and the remaining commercial. And Kirkland Lakes is 67%. And the variability in the peer group was, it started from 65%, the lowest weighted on residential, and then the highest weight on residential was 72%. So there really isn't that big of variability in the weighting between the 5 municipalities, the 6 municipalities in our group, Kirkland Lake plus the 5 comparators. And it is shown in the next slide at the at the 4th line from the bottom. Yeah. Then does that answer your question?
Kind of, well, the taxable assessment on these numbers, are they including industrial and commercial or excluding industrial and commercial?
They are in this specific number.
Well, you got 115,000 Kirkland Lake, you got 247, and if you're including industrial and commercial, then is that?
The assessment is higher in Temiskaming Shores.
But is that residential? We're not, now we're looking at total assessment, right? Including
72%
everything.
72% of it is residential. Does that answer it?
I think if you look at the breakdown in the assessment that is reflected, the commercial and industrial would be captured in the non-residential percentage of the assessment, so that the residential is purely residential and multi-res, where there are multi-residential complexes in existence. And then the comparison on a per household basis would reflect the residential.
Where it gets a little confusing, I can understand what Eugene is saying, because Temiskaming Shores, New Liskeard, has about I think about 120 million in, say, commercial and industrial. We have barely 50. So let's face it, the residential taxpayer is going to pay the premium more so than the commercial industrial. Even though our rates are high, they're paying higher than New Liskeard, that's for sure. So it's hard to, that comparison's a tough one to understand. Councilor Owen?
Yeah, on page 47, it says to me here, if I'm reading this right, and correct me if I'm wrong, the residential assessment percentage for Kirkland Lake is 67%, which is lower than Cochrane, which is 75%, right? Lower than Fort Frances, which is 70%, lower than Hearst, which is 70%, low, 2% higher than Cap, and lower than Temiskaming, which is 72%. Non-residential percentage assessment, in Kirkland Lake it's 33%, Cochrane 25, Fort Francis 30, Hearst 30, 35 in Cap, and 28%. So that, to me, that's the breakdown, I believe, that Eugene was looking for, but I may not have that correct.
But you look at that too, Rick, it's, Kirkland Lake's at 548 million, assessment. Temiskaming Shores is double that. In total assessment. So, anyway, I don't wanna dwell on just Temiskaming compared to us.
I've taken note of it, and I will provide we will provide an update with a detailed breakdown of that, especially if it sounds that it's important to you. Then, looking at the operating expenses per capita, they were below the average of the peer group in the years 2013, 2018. The levels of capital investments are the highest in the peer group, and more than double the average, again, reflecting recent capital projects. Reserves, and this is something we want to draw attention on. Kirkland Lake has the lowest per capita reserves when compared to the peer group, and its 2018 level of $495 per capita is less than half of the average of the peer group. The debt per capita of $2,281 per capita is 10% higher than the average of its peer group, and the total assessment, the total value of taxable assessment per household is lower than its peer group, 38% lower than its peer than the average of its peer group. In the next page, we have more of that data shown that we already looked at before for the taxable assessment, and we've highlighted some things that stand out, particularly the reserves per capita and the capital expenditures per capita, which are lower in the case of reserves, significantly lower than the average, and in the case of capex per capita, higher. On page 48, we wanted to draw your attention on a couple numbers. One being that Kirkland Lake spends 14.7% of its net operating expenses, of its operating expenses on protection services, and it's the third highest in its peer group, but it's much higher than Cochrane. And then equivalently for social and family services, it is the second highest percentage of spending amongst its peer group, and that is primarily because of the Tech Pioneer residents. So depending on which services are delivered in-house in each municipality, these numbers are different. So it's very important to consider this when taking them into consideration. Yes.
I just find it ironic that Mr. Shore, who doesn't have a full-time area lot,
Temiskaming Shores that 16 point.
When you isolate their numbers on fire, though, they are about $1 million less. Report on that, please.
I mean, Mr. Shore's $1 million less.
Certain. Yeah.
Percentage is higher.
It's gotta be on
Policing, so.
policing.
Spend somewhere else. Then again, we wanted to highlight that Kirkland Lake's debt per capita is marginally higher than its average group. And then it becomes about the options and what understanding the goalposts.
So So we were asked the question by each of you. If we had no choice but to reduce costs, what options could we explore given our statutory and contractual responsibilities and the current state of our operations? In other words, where do we stick out? And what could we take a look at? And so we set out to try and answer that question for you by dividing your categories of expenditure into sort of three different buckets. Any one of the options that we identify, you know, could require some upfront investment or some transition costs, or they could come with transition costs, or they could require time because you could be bound by existing contracts. It could require upfront investments. So none of the stuff, frankly, that we're going to be talking about is necessarily easy, but it's all worth talking about to answer the strategic question, what could you do? And so we came up with three buckets. These are to some degree subjective, but when we looked at your so-called category 1, which we defined as core services, which are things that, you know, frankly, every municipality delivers, and where Kirkland Lake delivers them in a way that is more or less consistent with the way in which most municipalities deliver them. That's distinct from category 2, which we would call category of services that are still core, but where you stick out to some degree because of the way in which you deliver them. And stick out doesn't necessarily mean stick out badly. I want to emphasize that. It's just where there's a choice in how you do it that other peer municipalities have made a different choice. So, for example, you know, the form of fire service that you have, or the form of insourced or outsourced garbage, or that kind of thing. So things where there are opportunities to take a look at doing it differently. The third are the so-called true discretionary services. These are things which you're under no obligation to provide as a municipality, but you do. You know, you could discontinue them, but of course, as with any discontinuance, there'd be a loss, would come with transitional costs. And we just note, we assessed that about 77% of what you do pretty much in the normal way of doing things. And so core services that you do normally. And for those services, it's not that there's no opportunity for improvement, far from it. But what it means is that what you're really looking at is continuous improvement, efforts to improve the way in which you do things on a day-to-day basis, but where really revolutionary change probably isn't much of an option for you. And we put a lot of stake, given some of the issues that we identified earlier about those 4 core gaps. We actually think that you are probably more likely, if you will, to follow the old adage, you're more likely to find 25 improvements of 1% than you are of 125% improvement in the mix of services that you have at Kirkland Lake. In the bucket of category 2s, that's about 20%. So it's worth taking a look at. But as you'll see, each of them have got challenges associated with them. And frankly, you may like them just the way they are. But you asked us what's different and sticks out, and so we tried to answer them.
Core service transportation is what?
Sorry?
What's transportation services?
Well, that's everything associated with roads.
Oh, okay.
And the discretionary services, they're only 3%. So as you move into the detail, and these are based on your 2018 or 2019 numbers?
This is based on the net 2019.
Net 2019. So these are the 77%. As we say, they're not Cadillac and they don't stick out. So they're not so much candidates for transformational change. The more, now we spent a lot of time working with your staff about these sorts of things. So what they are is candidates for continuous improvement opportunities. And credit goes to your staff who helped us identify a lot of opportunities in this regard. So we, in the bound document here that's, you know, the 100 pages long, there's a lot of recommendations for efficiencies, value-added procedures, or measures to create or update policies that are either going to increase your transparency or your confidence or trust. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And there's 3 tables that follow that just give you a quick summary of the sorts of things that we are making recommendations on. And as I said, the blue ones are coded as efficiency ones, and the green ones are coded as value adds. And we're not proposing to get into the details here, but you know, the sorts of things relate to improvements in your procurement process or improvements in the way in which you manage your facilities or the like, or optimize the performance of your various facilities to try and get some of your revenues up, or improve your budget cycle or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of detailed stuff in there. One of the interesting things, and this we actually think is pretty valuable, and it's one of the reasons why we would believe that you're going to be in a good position to make some forward progress, is with a couple of swaths of your organization. We did process mapping exercises, and what we found was it was like a breath of fresh air for a lot of your team. Process mapping is, and you guys, council, you saw the results of some of the work, because we had those great big sheets up on the charts up on the wall, where it was the work of your team, and I drew it to your attention during the council strategic planning session. What we would do is, with 10 or 12 or 15 of your staff, we'd take a process and we just sort of trace the path of the process from the point of view of a beginning to the point of an ending, and with a view towards trying to identify opportunities for improvements, or figuring out where their blockages are, or that kind of thing. And so, for example, we did work on purchasing and purchase orders and purchase requisitions and that kind of thing. And we found a huge amount of energy for both identifying problems and fixing problems, and a lot of people who are really kind of quite interested in the sort of empowering methodology of getting everybody together around a room to fix it. I mean, your acting CAO was in one of the sessions, and it was actually kind of like coming to you know, it's like a group therapy session. People were feeling quite good about, oh yeah, this has always bothered to me, and we haven't had a forum for fixing it. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize is, when we do our work, we don't just go off and study by ourselves, and we don't just listen and talk to people. We also try and teach people how to help themselves. And I think that your staff team is very ready for this sort of group, team-oriented process mapping, fixing kind of exercises. And as you get your new managers in here, I think you'll find that people will take to that kind of thing like ducks to water, and that will be your main methodology for making progress on the various activities that you see set out here. Category 2 is the more interesting category. And again, don't jump to the conclusion that we're saying that there's changes that should be made in all of these things off the top. But about 20% of the services in these Category 2 services are core services, but where there are legitimate opportunities to do things differently over time, or they reflect choices that you've made that that you could revisit in due course. The principal ones, and each one of these is still core, so it's not like you'd ever do without them necessarily. But there are ways to consider how you could go about doing them, and there's a slide on each. The first we draw your attention to is just Tech Pioneer residents. It is not typical for northern municipalities in particular to actually deliver on their own books long-term care facility like this. It's certainly a very highly regarded facility and service, but the net annual subsidy to the municipal budget is about 4%. So we were told that there is a business case potentially subject to the availability of land, to try and invest in new beds for TPR. Basically, the gist of it is that with the requirements for maintaining certain levels of staffing, if you have, there's certain numbers of beds that optimize the requirements of staff versus the revenue from the various beds. And so if you could build a business case for making the investment to increase the number of beds with some, presumably with some capital from the province, you might well be able to get it so that you could optimize or minimize the actual annual operating subsidy. The other thing, it is always important to do an annual review of the resident rates, just to make sure that you're doing full cost recovery of what you are permitted to recover, recognizing that the province has rules and regulations associated with all of this. But in general, the goal should be to reduce the required levels of subsidy in a responsible way over time. Like, that's the least that you should be considering doing on this one. because it's a significant sum of money. And it's not to say that you'd necessarily get out of the business, but what we'd be seeking to do is to try to optimize the business. And it could well be that over time there'd be a longer term business case around making that investment to get the annual operating subsidy down. That is one that's definitely worth having on your mind. The second one is somewhat more controversial. It just speaks to the whole question of the fire department. There is no question that a full-time hybrid model of delivery in fire is very expensive. As we already noted, Timiskaming Shores has a volunteer model, and it's about $1 million a year less. It's obviously a mandatory thing to have a fire service that meets your operational requirements and fire safety adequacy standards and that sort of thing. But if you were to answer the question, what is a significant service that we could make a change to that would drive a significant change in numbers? This is one that you can't be silent on. The issue, of course, is the transitional costs. Anytime changes like this are made, there's a significant hesitation or opposition from that can arise from the fire services unions, and so it's just important to bear in mind there's nothing easy in this, but it is a core service that is delivered in a manner which is expensive relative to your peers, and therefore it appropriately belongs in these pages. A lesser version of that is to just see whether there's an argument that your adequacy standards could be met with a slightly different and smaller deployment, and you might be able to make the argument that you get by with a lighter deployment.
Comment from Councillor Owen.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're aware of the latest development, but our volunteers recently unionized. And I'm not sure if you were aware of that when this was written.
No, I'm not sure that we were.
Yeah, because that would change the whole perspective of how much we could save if we wanted to get rid of the professionals, because they're still going to be paying professional rates.
Yeah.
So
the third one that we wanted to call out is in relation to waste management. And honestly, this is here because it belongs on this list because you have an outsourced model. We're not particularly calling out that we don't like your outsourced model. We are simply pointing out that there are those that do outsourcing and there are those that don't. What we note is if the FIRs are to be believed, Kirkland Lake's costs per ton are somewhat higher than its peers, and your waste volumes appear to be somewhat high. The thing about FIRs is the data in them is always the beginning point for a deeper conversation as opposed to something you can truly go to the bank on. But it's a large enough spend, and it's in an area where you have choices to make. Now, you're early in the stage of a 5-year contract, so it's not like this is something that would be early in the horizon of being able to do very differently anyway because of the nature of your current contractual arrangement. But like the previous things, it is relevant that waste management is something that you'd want to keep your eye on. You may also want to consider measures to decrease the volume of waste per capita and to just try and manage the costs of the overall system. It's also relevant that the province is changing the rules in regard to the blue box, and so that'll be changing under your feet over the next couple of years too, with the move to full producer responsibility. But that's the third biggest chunk. And the last one is the library. Again, libraries are a statutory service, so there's no question about abandoning the service. But it did occur to us that there may well be some opportunities to try and see and just make certain that you've reduced the administrative cost or optimized the services through partnerships with the town, just to make sure that the back office at the library is optimized as much as possible. Also to see whether there's possibilities in either achieving better service or better efficiencies in partnership as between the museum and the, potentially Heritage North. But those, this is a relatively smaller dollar. The Aquatic Center is another piece that's, a large piece. It's obviously viewed as a first-rate asset. It's not typical for a municipality of this size to have such an asset, but that ship has sailed, as it were. So the main goal for this facility has got to be to increase its value to the community so that you capture as much of the value as you can from it. Ensure that its revenue generating potential is as high as possible through usage and, potentially linking it to your ongoing economic development efforts to get, so potentially regional events getting in there. But having reviewed the Aquatic Center, it seems to be that the primary value there is to just make use of it as much as possible now that you have it and optimize the revenues associated with it.
Comment from Councillor Owen?
Yeah, there's no percentage in net operating expense for the Aquatic Center. Why is that? All the other places have it.
Oh, we just didn't have the data broken out for us from the staff.
Well, okay, because that's kind of critical information that we should have,
I'm
and
sure,
it's not there.
I'm sure we can get it for you. The final one is,
Oh, go ahead.
did you have that?
So I believe this actually, we want to make a particular reference to the Aquatic Center, given its latest addition next to the arena.
Yeah. I think we've got the arena in the 77% because what's non-typical is the scope of the Aquatic Center. It's not a surprising thing for a municipality to have an arena. So we've included that under the continuous improvement stuff in the 77%. Just the last two are in the non-core services. So this is the museum and Heritage North. These are significant insofar as they amount to 3%, but it's only 3% in total. Heritage North, and these are the 2019 numbers, net operating expense of $393,000. It was beyond the scope of what we were doing to do a kind of a market sounding to figure out if there's an opportunity to dispose of that sort of the asset. But obviously the goal should be to eliminate the need for the operational subsidy through continued success in revenue growth. There has been marginal success in the revenue growth over the last year or so, and continued efforts to manage and reduce operating costs. So we'll be continuing to seek partnerships and sales to the private sector. There may be an opportunity to continue to manage the value of the operations by continuing to seek some back office efficiencies. And on the museum side, again, the main issue here that you've got is while it's a valuable community asset, it is a discretionary service, and you could address this if you deemed it necessary to achieve savings. It is not a significant operating cost, but there is this legacy issue with Heritage Ontario that has the potential to trigger these ongoing deferred maintenance obligations. So the real thing there is if you wanted to proceed with that, you'd have to get into negotiations with Ontario Heritage to see, and potentially with this government, it might be possible to see if you could come into an arrangement that could address that side of the building. But what we were trying to do was, through the course of these three categories, answer the question, what's the order of magnitude, or what's the scale of your opportunities? And I think the main point of it is really, you may want to do some investigation further on these pieces, but you've got a huge opportunity in the core services, and you're 77% to make a lot of incremental progress. I think if you want to grasp the nettle of one of these special projects and address it, then by all means do so. Define it as a special project, devote appropriate resources to it, and get into it. But on an order of magnitude, we wanted to answer the question for you. you know, is the game worth the candle relative to your overall needs? And so we thought that it was, you know, helpful to present it in this format.
Comment from Councillor Owen?
Yeah, I may have missed it, you may have already explained this, but how did you come up with, what's your definition of core service and non-core service?
So there's a number of services that are defined by the Municipal Act as being things that municipalities have to do.
Yeah.
And then there's another sort of suite of services which are just typically offered by municipalities. And so the classic example that you get down south, I'm not sure if anybody would ever be crazy enough to do this up here, but you often have some municipalities who in the 1970s got into the habit of either sending one of those little trucks with the elephant nozzle on the end to go and pick up people's leads out of the end of culverts so that folks didn't have to rake their own leaves. Now, that is not a required service. That would be considered a Cadillac service to residents, and that's the kind of thing that is frequently discussed for getting rid of. As we went through what we could go through in terms of there being a service inventory of Kirkland Lake, mindful that there actually is no service inventory of Kirkland Lake, we were not able to find anything that was a service that was akin to a leaf sucker service. Or there's other services that, like, it's considered a Cadillac service to actually have a small plow follow along behind the large plows to remove the windrows at the end of the driveway that are caused by the heavy plowing activity. That's like North York used to do that, and it's a very expensive service. It's that we would have called that a non-core service. So there's no obligation to run a museum or to have something like the Heritage North, so we would call those non-core services. I suspect that as we get into the service inventory, you may find that there's the odd activity here or there in the odd department that is something that, you know, might not fit within a policy that you would define as being something that is absolutely a priority of Kirkland Lake that needs to be continued. But from the course of our interviews, what we concluded was the bigger challenge of Kirkland Lake was not how many people there were sitting around looking for work to do, but rather how there were not enough people trying to get the core stuff done. And so our assessment of core really came down to the whole what's mandatory versus what's discretionary, and you have relatively small dollars in the discretionary side of things. And our category 2 core, that was not so much questioning whether it was still going to be something that was a mandatory thing to do or not, but just whether there was anything special about the way in which you did it that gave you a reason to take a look at it. So what I would say is there is a huge amount of opportunity for you to do, to root out small wastes and small inefficiencies, or put more positively, to do continuous improvement, to find ways to just make your overall services better and more consistent with your policies through the vast majority of your core services. But you don't have a lot of stuff that sort of would come under a normal definition of this is not mandatory, this is discretionary, and this is unnecessary.
Well, it doesn't seem to line up with what I was told is in the Municipal Act is core and non-core services. Like a swimming pool is not a core service. I'm sure it doesn't say in the Municipal Act that a town of 7,900 has to have a swimming pool, yet we call that a core service in this study. The library, as you point out, is a core service. Tech Pioneer, again, that's not a core service. That's not something we have to offer under the Municipal Act, is my understanding. And that's where I'm getting confused, because of the labels you put on these services don't seem to match up with what the law is.
So the reason why we didn't use the term mandatory, like must be delivered by the Municipal Act to define core versus non-core, was because we were trying to give you an assessment that included both the practical realities of operating a municipality, because while you're absolutely right, it's not a mandatory thing to have a swimming pool, it is also not a surprising thing to have a swimming pool. And we actually deliberately chose the term core to reflect that those are things that are typically provided by municipalities, and your way of doing it was in the case of the Aquatic Center, you could very easily say it was a choice that you might not have made at the time of at the time it was made. But now that you've got it, there's not a lot you can do about it, which is why we didn't go to the Municipal Act definition of things that were like mandatory, because we didn't think that that was helpful to your decision-making process, because your choice is not really, as council members, to just get rid of everything that isn't mandatory, because you've got sunk costs that are a practical reality that you have to deal with. So we were actually trying to answer the relevant question for you as opposed to the legal question, which is why we didn't follow legal
Yeah,
definition.
well, my problem is this is a public study. And now we put out into the public in this study that offering the pool is a core service, and it's not. And I think that has to be made perfectly clear that the term core service in this study does not really mean core service under the Municipal Act. They're two totally different things. And I'd hate for the public to think that certain things that we offer are mandated that we have to offer, and that's what core suggests in its name, and that's a concern. The public needs to know that these are not mandated services, even though they're called core services.
Well,
And I'll drop it at that.
well, we're certainly happy to add in a technical note that describes further what we mean by core, but I think the way we've described core doesn't actually say that it's a mandatory service, but I take your political point. We were actually trying to be sensitive to the other political reality, that it's not really for you to stand on the Municipal Act definitions of mandatory service, and that's why we didn't use that term.
But Councillor Irwin does bring a good point, because when we think of core services, fire department, police protection, and a pool is not a core service. So I understand what he's saying. Councillor White?
Yeah, just to add to this conversation, it's very, very Kirkland Lake specific. That's why you wouldn't have thought to put it into your report. It's very, very Kirkland Lake specific that we have to be very, very clear on our definition. So that's, I assume, why you wouldn't have picked up on that.
Yeah, Councillor Ivanov.
You know, I mean, the Tri-Towns consider bus services core service. So if you look at when they list core services, that's a core service. We don't even have buses in Kirkland Lake, so, right? That's how,
Yeah.
right? So,
It's not a defined term.
it's not, that's right. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. One of the other issues, and it's the history of Kirkland Lake, we provide more services than a lot of other small communities do. We pick up commercial garbage twice a week downtown, is that not correct? Yeah, on Government Road? No.
We do at health
Thanks for
services,
pointing that out.
we do at health services that are located within the community as well, because the garbage truck comes down to the group home twice a week.
Yeah. And when we scarify the roads, we're gonna go through this again this winter, and the Works Department takes heavy criticism. If they don't send a front-end loader behind the grader to clean the driveways out, we've been doing it for years. And people at we haven't done a good job of managing our residents' expectations. And I'm not saying we spoiled them, because I can understand why they figure they should get that. But these are just some of the issues that we've had up our backs against the wall.
Well, and that's actually the policy gap that we described in the very
I
first
agree.
page of the section.
I would also offer that councils make decisions from time to time and from council to council in terms of quality of life services. And ideally, if we're communicating as an organization to our communities, those services that are being provided and responding to expectations, and it is explained to the public, they will generally acknowledge that they're willing to pay whatever it's going to take to have those services provided, as long as they understand what the implications are. And so, to your point, Mr. Mayor, with regard to managing expectations, that is a significant challenge. And those expectations may change, as councils change, as the community and the residents will change. And the challenge is obviously to be able to be responsive, but also to be communicative so that everyone understands what those services are and what their taxes are being what the taxes are supporting in terms of service and program delivery.
I think there's still the mentality that we've got that service for the last 30 or 40 years, but don't raise my taxes. We hear it every day. We're not the only community, I'm sure. But
No, that would be pretty common. But it's also common that there's no such thing as a silver bullet in municipal finance. And really, what you're going to be talking about is, as you identified in your strategic plan, your biggest problem is about coming up with a long-term discipline plan for your sustainability. And the biggest single thing that we've noted was you're going to have a longer-term plan for paying down your debt and increasing your reserves and looking after your ongoing assets. And that's going to be the thing that's going to be the constant for the next 10 years. And where we think you've got the biggest opportunities is frankly in the continuous improvement in what I would until a moment ago have called core services, and what I'll now just refer to as services, which we have perhaps idiosyncratically defined as core, but what we mean as being the things that you do that are commonly done, and that aren't odd that you do, and the ones that really stick out as being truly discretionary. There's quality of life issues associated with those, but there's business cases that make it work, and I think if you bring them back in a way that allow you to make some responsible trade-offs, what you have here is a kind of an order of magnitude document that says that this is where you ought to look, where the ongoing day-to-day pressure is, I think can in large measure be offset, at least for a year or two, with the continuous improvement piece in the largest category of your spending because of where you're starting. And that's where the policies and job descriptions and getting back to good old-fashioned orderly public sector management, that's the biggest single gap that we found. Wasn't in people's effort, and it wasn't in people's passion, and it wasn't in it was honestly in the breakdowns that came about because of the gaps. And we think that there's a considerable amount of room for improvement there, and frankly there's already evidence of it happening. One of the things that we noted was as you mentioned, Mr. Mayor, as we came in and did the workshops with people, a lot of recommendations that we were making spontaneously just wound up getting implemented because they weren't significant, they weren't things that required council approval, they were just good common sense things that people started adopting, and they're already starting to make a difference. And I think what you're going to find is on the operating side there's a lot of room for that kind of improvement, and I would guess that in 6 months you're going to be continuing to see the same kind of arc of improvement that you've seen for the last 3 or 4, which I think had a lot to do with the arrival of the acting CAO.
I know that when I read this, Kirkland Lake is taxing its residents 20% less on property, and I can get where you've got this from. I know MPAC has done an absolutely horrible job at doing assessments in Kirkland Lake, and there's homes that are paying $700 and $600 a year in taxes, and homes of equal value in communities south of us, for example. If you had a similar home, your taxes would be 50% of what you pay in Kirkland Lake. I mean, the tax rate is for homes that have been properly assessed, the discrepancy is huge compared to homes that are, and the MPAC, I mean, I don't know the last time MPAC actually did an MPAC study in Kirkland Lake or any other community. I mean, how do you do with the whole province, when you should be? So you simply took resale values of homes get sold, that these homes that haven't been sold in the last 25, 30 years, are still being assessed at 40 and 50,000, where their value is probably 120,000 in today's market. But those MPAC numbers never change because the home has never been sold. So, you know, when you say, if I told somebody that the taxes in Kirkland Lake were 20% less than our peer communities, they would tell me to eat out.
Do you want to just comment?
Well, Councillor, I wouldn't disagree with some of the commentary with regard to impact, but at the same time, they do reevaluations or revaluations every 4 years, and it is based on current value assessments. So to your point of homes that have not been sold recently, there is no historic benchmark for them to reflect in an upgrade. And I'm not trying to defend impact by any stretch, but the numbers that we've collected, Kirkland Lake's assessed values compared to Temiskaming Shores, for example, are more than 50% less, which means the tax rate to generate the same amount of taxation has to be significantly higher, of course. So that may be grounds for some advocacy and some conversation specifically with impact as it relates to conditions in Kirkland Lake, the basis on which valuations are being determined and revised on a 4-year basis, which 2020 is a new valuation year coming up. So it would be very timely for that conversation to occur, and perhaps some explanations as to what gaps there might be or what issues that they may need to address given the specifics of circumstance in the Kirkland Lake area.
See, I don't think it's that simple to solve, because quite honestly, impact does not have assessment officers going out to the house and looking, doing house inspections. All they're doing for values is taking the MLS sales, not listings, but the sale price of properties and using that. And it's like Eugene said, that house that's been lived in for 30 years hasn't changed hands, so the new assessed value is, all they're using is the resale value and the multiple listings.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever gone out to these houses.
Yeah, and
unless-
building permits.
Yeah, and permits. So the whole system, I mean, we can't change that overnight, I realize that, but it is an issue.
It would be worth a conversation with them in that impact has, from my experience, made significant inroads, particularly following the Ombudsman's report
It is
on
bad.
some of their issues. However, like anything else, it takes time, and an opportunity for them to respond, I think, would be reasonable. And also, some communities are in fact unique from others, and circumstance will dictate that the cookie cutter approach that works in other areas may not be working here because of certain circumstance. So it may very well be an issue that you could reach out to your MPPs as well as to the impact officials for a sit-down discussion on what the activities are and their practices that are being applied, particularly in Kirkland Lake.
Councillor Owen?
The last time, to the best of my knowledge, that Impact did a full door-to-door survey, Bill Enoy was mayor. I remember it very well because when I went home, my young son said to me, "Dad, somebody from the assassin's office was just here." So I went up the street, I invited the man into my house. He said, "No, that's not necessary. Have you made any changes?" I said, "No." When I went to appeal my assessment, they had it on their records that they had done an in-house assessment of my house, and they'd never been in my house, and they would not change. So there's problems with them. They're cutting corners, they're not doing the job right. But when Bill Enoy was mayor, he did a lot of lobbying, and they did go door to door, and that's, I don't know how many years ago now. But even the work they did, as far as I'm concerned, was shoddy. I mean, just to take my word for it when they don't know me, not good.
So, Mr. Mayor, when folks have a chance, the operational review goes into greater detail into all these different areas. We didn't propose to talk about it tonight, given the amount of time and the fact that we still have to get through the organizational matters. But we would see that as being of assistance to the, to the new management team as it largely comes into action as a place to look for places to start. And again, we'd really want to sort of call out the fact that this isn't so much us, you know, playing auditor general to, you know, find fault with the way things are done, so much as it is your staff saying, yeah, you know, this is something we'd like to fix, or yeah, this is something that isn't working as well as it could, or yeah, this is something. So a lot of these ideas, I think you'll find, are not so much impositions upon your staff as expressions of what your staff would like to achieve themselves. And so in that regard, I think very helpful. Now, if there are any other questions on the operational, we can get into the organizational. If you wish, I can just, there's a couple of slides, and this would tend to follow at the end of the org review, but again, for the benefit of those, so they don't have to stick around and wait. There's a couple of slides that just speak to putting the entire plan into action, and we just have a couple of quick observations. The first is, a paper plan isn't enough. I mean, it's obvious, but there's, in our experience, and I think coming out of the literature, there's at least 6 different things that you need to do, or that you need to have in alignment to make sure that a Surlox-bound report doesn't just sit on the shelf and lead to a lot of nothingness. So just on that point, you need to have corporate plans and service policies that actually define what you're going to be delivering in levels of detail. And this is how you go from what Councillor Ivanov was referring to as kind of the generalities of a strategic plan down to the detailed operating. This is specifically how we're going to do it, or what I was referring to as taking you into SMART goals. You know, if you go back to the SWOT, there was repeated observations about service standards need to be reset. We've got service standards for 15,000, but a community of 7,500, just as Councillor Owen had been sort of suggesting, or out-of-date service policies for discretionary services. And so, in our opinion, the draft strategic plan is well aligned with that general direction and leading to help address those observed weaknesses from the SWOT. Because if we do a kind of a cross-check, do the various pieces that you have add up to an improvement on the problems that you've observed. And so there's one sort of bucket of observed problems that help to be addressed by the actual plans that'll implement the strategic direction. So then the second thing, and we'll be talking about the organization plan in a minute, but the most important thing is that you've got form follows function. The org design shouldn't come from the air, it shouldn't come from somebody's mind. It should be a tool that's designed to be able to implement what you want it to do. And so the most important piece is that you can't design the optimal organization if you haven't defined what its mission is for the next couple of years. So you want to design that structure to deliver the things that you intended to deliver to the standards that you intended to deliver them, and delineate the roles of each position and spell out the relationships and optimize the use of the assets. And as we think you'll see in a minute, we think the org plan is useful in that regard. And it will address some of the problems that have been identified about some positions having too many tasks and some services not being aligned with the service profile or chain of command issues and the like. The third piece is you got to have performance management, and we know that that's an area where once in the Kirkland Lake that we know and love right now, the performance management, performance measurement is really not a detailed in practice thing. I mean, certainly there's been lots of pockets where people are working on it and improving it, but that's kind of one of the areas where there are the biggest gaps, which probably lead to the greatest frustrations by everybody about being able to actually define progress. And so that helps us address what we heard from the SWOT about there being no sustained continuous improvement program and inadequate performance measurement. Culture and morale. You know, you've all heard the line about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so, you know, your culture can either motivate people or demotivate people. And frankly, there's no percentage in having tolerating a culture that's demotivating people. You need to get the best out of your staff. So your strategy has got to assess that culture and figure out how to let it be. You know, frankly, internal transparency is one of the best things to help overcome problems, and helping create clarity for people around roles and expectations and all that kind of thing is a very positive contribution to it. And so, you know, there is going to have to be work on that, because that was an observed thing. But I think one of the things that's quite optimistic is there's evidence of improved performance even on that score, even in the last couple of months. Succession planning and talent development. This is critical because you have so many anticipated turnovers coming in the next few years that it's not just about patching the holes that you have in the organizational structure now. It's going to be about preparing for the ones that you know are going to come, just because as time marches on, so do people's retirement plans. So there really needs to be a comprehensive approach to like acting on these interim positions, and I know there's been a lot of progress on that even in the last couple of weeks, so you probably get a check mark there already, and recruiting for the vacancies, but also planning for the coming retirements and developing the talent management plan. One of the things we heard again and again and again was that there isn't adequate training or there isn't adequate onboarding, and so one of the things that we've made recommendations about in the operating plan is a renewed focus on that kind of training, to make sure that where you're getting people who have some gaps in their formal education or development as municipal executives, that we'd be addressing that sort of thing. And this would wind up addressing the other observed concerns about uncertainty and excessive turnover and the lack of succession planning and the wave of eligible planned retirements. So, and then finally, there's this whole sort of notion of change management. You know, if you're going to engage in a big exercise of change, you've got to really communicate, and if you've also got to really commit to let change work, and if you get involved in sort of flavor of the month type moments, it does real damage to the culture that was described above. So that's where the anchor of a strategic plan that says these are the goals, and then staff plans that say this is how we're going to implement them, and then just let them be, because you're going to be at this for 3 to 5 years fixing the place. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months. And so what it means is kind of restoring counsel to what is best practice, which is a strategic level of management, and letting staff be focused on what's best practice, which is the actual operational level of management, and moving to a more normalized kind of approach to things based on, you know, the product of this hard work, and that will tend to fix some of the other problems that have been observed. But so where we wind up on this is there's already a lot of progress being made. If you strengthen these various linkages and follow through on your commitment to address your long-term financial and asset management plans, that's the biggest single change that you can make. Your continuous improvement in your category 1 and probably category 2 services, the biggest thing that's going to do for you is help offset ongoing cost pressures. I'm not saying that it'll necessarily help you find cuts or actual net savings, but it should help you offset some of the growth in costs that you're otherwise, you know, going to have to count on. And you know, what you're going to need is an orderly decision-making process to decide on any things in the category 2s or 3s that you do want to take on as significant challenges, but put a red circle around those things and make sure that they're not disrupting your ongoing day-to-day operations, because your biggest opportunity is in your day-to-day operations. And you're going to have to keep building your team and be the partner the private sector needs, and set and stay the course, because you're going to be at this for a while. So that's basically the overarching advice that sort of leads towards thinking about how to implement this stuff. And that would get us to the end of the summary, and then and then we can move into the organizational review, which would be a matter which I think you would deem in camera, because it deals with personnel matters. That's the sort of the last piece that would have drawn all these other pieces together.
I have a resolution. It's moved by Councillor Dennis Perrier, seconded by Councillor Rick Owen. The council adjourned its special meeting on December 17th, 2019 to an in-camera meeting pursuant to Section 239(2) of the Municipal Act to receive confidential information on the organizational review by Strategy Corps concerning identifiable persons.